I thought my marriage was built on silence. On patience. On understanding. On the belief that love meant adapting yourself to someone else's limits. My husband couldn't hear. So I learned to speak less. To write instead of talk. To lower my voice, my needs, my entire life. What I didn't know was that he was listening the whole time, not just to me, but to everything people said when they thought I couldn't understand. The truth didn't come out in a fight. Or a confession. It came out at a dinner table, surrounded by people who believed I was invisible. And when my husband finally spoke out loud, I realized the silence had never been his. I was standing in our kitchen in Mountain View, 6 months pregnant, my hands trembling as I held the note I'd just written for my husband. That was how we communicated. How we always had. Through handwritten notes. Through gestures, through quiet looks and careful touches. My husband, Ethan, was deaf. At least, that's what I had believed for the past year and a half. He stood behind me, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck, reading the note over my shoulder. I was asking him something simple. Red wine or white, I never finished turning around. Because behind me, in a clear, steady voice I had never heard before, he said, "Claire, I need to tell you something." The paper slipped from my fingers. It floated to the floor between us like it didn't belong to reality at all. Because my deaf husband had just spoken, let me go back. Some stories can't be understood starting from the moment they explode. They have to be told from the beginning. Even when the beginning is painful to remember. I'm 64 years old now. I've learned that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes, it's just the sound of truth waiting its turn. This began more than 30 years ago. In 1993, I was 31, still single, working long hours as a junior designer at a mid-sized architecture firm in San Francisco. I lived alone in a narrow apartment I could barely afford, with windows that faced an alley instead of a view. Every Sunday afternoon, my mother called like clockwork. And every Sunday, the conversation somehow circled back to the same subject: your cousin just had another baby. The neighbor's daughter got engaged. Do you ever think about settling down? I'd stare out the window at the fog rolling in and tell her I was fine. But the truth was, I was tired. Tired of empty apartments, tired of being the only single woman at family gatherings. Tired of watching coworkers leave early for school plays while I stayed late finishing projects. So when my mother mentioned Ethan Parker, I listened. He was successful. Well respected. The founder of a growing software company in Silicon Valley, and, she added carefully, he was deaf. A motorcycle accident years earlier, she said. Permanent hearing loss. He's learned to adapt, she told me. He reads lips beautifully. Uses sign language. Most women don't want to deal with that, but I thought you might understand. I should have heard the manipulation in her voice. Instead, I heard opportunity. A man who wouldn't judge me for being 31 and unmarried. A man who might appreciate patience instead of perfection. A man who, because of his disability, might truly see me. I agreed to one dinner. Just one. And I had no idea that dinner would change the course of my entire life. We met at a small Italian restaurant near Palo Alto. Ethan arrived early. He stood when I approached the table, smiling politely, his eyes fixed on my face in a way that felt intense, but not uncomfortable. He read my lips carefully as I introduced myself, nodding with practiced ease. Conversation was slower than I was used to, deliberate. Measured. I spoke clearly. He watched closely. When words failed, we wrote notes on folded napkins, laughing softly at how awkward and intimate it felt. There was no background noise for him. No distractions. Just me. And that attention felt intoxicating. Ethan told me about his company, Aurora Systems, a fast-growing tech startup focused on enterprise software. He had founded it with 2 partners, both of whom handled meetings and phone calls. I focus on strategy, he wrote. And numbers. He was disciplined. Controlled, impressive. When the check came, he paid without hesitation. Outside, as the evening fog crept in, he asked if he could see me again. I said yes. Within weeks, we were inseparable. I learned sign language late at night after work, practicing in front of the bathroom mirror until my hands ached. I labeled cabinets in our shared apartment. I adjusted the volume of my life downward, no loud music, no calling out from other rooms. I told myself it was love. Ethan moved into my apartment 3 months later. 6 months after that, he proposed. It was simple. Quiet. Thoughtful. He knelt in our living room, holding a small velvet box, his hands steady as he signed. "Will you marry me?" I cried. Not because it was perfect, but because it felt safe. The wedding was small, his parents. My mother. A few close friends. No music. No speeches. Just vows written on paper and exchanged by hand. I believed we were building something rare. A partnership based on patience. On trust. On understanding what others couldn't. When I became pregnant the following year, Ethan seemed pleased, but distant. He worked longer hours. Traveled more often. Spent nights staring at his laptop, fingers moving fast across the keyboard. He said the company was expanding. I believed him. I handled the rest. Doctor appointments. Household decisions, paperwork. Planning. I told myself this was normal. That every marriage has an imbalance. That love sometimes looks like carrying more weight. By the time I was 6 months pregnant, my life had grown very quiet. No music. Few visitors. Almost no phone calls. Just notes on the counter. Schedules taped to the fridge, and a growing sense that I was no longer a wife. I was a system keeping everything running. And I didn't realize yet that someone else had been listening all along. There were moments I couldn't explain. At first, I brushed them aside. Pregnancy does that to you, I told myself. It makes you sensitive. Paranoid, but patterns have a way of repeating themselves when you ignore them. Ethan claimed phone calls were difficult for him, yet I often found him alone in his office, door closed, laptop open, typing rapidly, then pausing as if listening. When I entered the room, he'd quickly turn the screen away and smile. I assumed he was video conferencing, reading captions. Still, something felt off. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I dropped a stack of towels. They hit the floor with a sharp, echoing thud. Ethan flinched. It was subtle. Almost invisible. But I saw it. Another time, a car alarm went off in the parking lot below our apartment. I was standing behind him, watching his shoulders tense for just a fraction of a second before he caught himself. Didn't say anything. I started paying attention. He woke up before my alarm in the mornings. He reacted when the microwave beeped. He seemed to know when the elevator doors opened, before I felt the vibration. When I asked, he wrote the same answer every time. I can feel it. I wanted to believe him. I needed to. Because the alternative was too unsettling to consider. Meanwhile, Aurora Systems was thriving. Magazine articles. Awards. Investor meetings. Ethan attended them all, always with an assistant, always positioned carefully at the table. He never spoke publicly. He never needed to. I handled communication with doctors and contractors. I scheduled meetings. I interpreted conversations for visitors who didn't know sign language. People praised me constantly. "You're amazing," they'd say. "So patient. So devoted." No one ever asked if I was tired. At night, lying awake beside him, I sometimes watched his face in the dark. He slept deeply. Peacefully. Too peacefully. I'd rest my hand on my stomach, feeling the baby move, and wonder if I was imagining things. Then came the incident that made it impossible to ignore. One evening, while Ethan was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Normally, I wouldn't have looked. But this time, the vibration kept going and going. I glanced down. The screen lit up with a message preview. Don't forget the call tomorrow. I'll handle the audio. Audio. My heart started to race. I locked the screen and stepped away as if I'd been burned. When Ethan came out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, he smiled and kissed my forehead. I smiled back. But something inside me had already shifted. Because for the first time, I wasn't wondering if I was wrong. I was wondering how long I'd been lied to. The dinner was Ethan's idea. A small gathering, he wrote, just business partners and a potential investor from overseas. He said it would look good for the company. A stable home, a supportive wife. I agreed. Not because I wanted to go, but because I wanted to see. That night, I wore a loose dress that hid my stomach and my nerves. I set the table carefully, placing name cards where Ethan had indicated. The guests arrived right on time. 3 men. All confident. All loud. They greeted Ethan warmly, speaking slowly at first, exaggerating their mouths the way people do when they think someone can't hear. Ethan smiled. Nodded. Played the role perfectly. During dinner, they switched languages. Japanese. They assumed I wouldn't understand. They assumed wrong. I'd studied Japanese in college. I hadn't spoken it in years, but language doesn't disappear. It waits. At first, the conversation was harmless. Business projections. Market expansion. Numbers and praise. Then the tone shifted. One of the men laughed and said something about how convenient it was to have a wife who handled everything. Another joked that Ethan was lucky. A woman who worked, cooked, translated, and asked for nothing. They spoke freely. About money I didn't know existed. About accounts in my husband's name only. About decisions already made, without me. Then one of them said something that made my stomach tighten. He mentioned another apartment. Another woman. Someone who understood the real Ethan. They laughed again. I didn't react. I kept eating. Kept pouring wine. Kept smiling like a woman who didn't understand a word. Ethan never looked at me. Not once. He knew. When the guests finally left, the house felt too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I stood at the sink, rinsing plates with shaking hands. That's when Ethan walked up behind me. Close. Calm and in a clear, steady voice. Not signed, not written. He said my name. Out loud. I didn't turn around right away. I was afraid that if I did, the world would look different, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Claire, Ethan said again. My name sounded wrong in his voice. Too natural. Too practiced. Slowly, I faced him. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't apologizing. He looked relieved. I was going to tell you eventually, he said, as if that explained everything. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. How long? I finally asked. He hesitated for just a second. Since before we met. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the counter to stay upright. He explained it like a business decision. After the accident years ago, he'd lost part of his hearing, but not all of it. With therapy, it came back. Slowly. Quietly. By the time we met, he could hear almost everything, so why lie? I asked. He sighed, rubbing his temples. People trust you more when they think you're vulnerable, he said. Investors. Partners. Even spouses. Spouses. He told me pretending to be deaf gave him control. Control over conversations. Control over expectations, control over what people chose to hide or reveal around him. You wouldn't have married me if you knew, he added, not cruelly. Just honestly. I thought about the notes. The silence. The years I had bent my life around his supposed disability. And the baby? I asked. His expression softened just slightly. The baby's real, he said quickly. That part was never a lie. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was unbearable. Everything I had given him. My patience, my voice, my independence. Had been offered to a man who was listening the entire time. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. We're still a good team, he said. We can move past this. That was when I finally understood. He wasn't confessing out of guilt. He was confident I wouldn't leave. Because he thought I had nowhere else to go. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse him. I didn't ask why, because by then, I already knew Ethan had never needed my forgiveness. He needed my compliance. That night, I slept in the guest room with my hands on my stomach, feeling the baby move, reminding myself that at least one truth inside this house was real. By morning, my decision was made. I didn't tell Ethan I was leaving. I didn't threaten divorce. I didn't demand explanations. I started planning. Quietly. I met with a lawyer 2 weeks later, someone recommended by a colleague, not connected to Ethan or Aurora Systems in any way. I brought documents I had copied over the years without realizing how important they would become: emails, contracts, financial statements I had translated and organized for him. The lawyer listened carefully, then she looked up and said, "You understand, you know everything." I did. Because he had never bothered to hide the truth from a woman he believed couldn't hear. When I told Ethan I was moving out, he was stunned. "You can't just leave," he said. "I can," I replied. Calmly. Clearly. Aloud, he stared at me, as if hearing my voice, really hearing it, for the first time. The divorce was quiet. Precise. Unavoidable. I didn't take revenge. I took my life back. Years later, people sometimes ask me how I didn't notice sooner. I tell them this. When someone benefits from your silence, they'll do everything they can to keep you quiet, but silence is not weakness. It's awareness waiting for courage. And the moment I chose to speak, I was never invisible again.